Hello, I'm Kevin Costner. Welcome back to 500 Nations. The first encounters between Europeans and Indian people are some of the most famous and important events in world history. Most of us can recite the names of Christopher Columbus's ships, the year he first landed in the New World, and how he mistakenly called the people he encountered there Indians. But few of us know the names of the people who greeted Columbus, or much about the lives they led. How did they greet the strangers? Were they treated like gods? Were they feared? Were they attacked? Or were they treated as a new and exotic trading partner by a people who had a long history of dealing with other seafaring cultures? The first meeting between European and American worlds would bring two very different cultures into conflict. We take you now to the Caribbean, where the rough road of contact begins. 500 Nations continues with A Clash of Cultures.
How much damage, how many calamities, disruptions and devastations of kingdoms have there been? How many souls have perished in the Indies over the years, and how unjustly? How many unforgivable sins have been committed? Bartolomé de las Casas.
In December of 1492, 3 ships under the command of Christopher Columbus approached the second largest island in the Caribbean. For 8 weeks, Columbus had traveled from the Bahamas to Cuba, finally reaching the site of modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the island he would name Hispaniola. The island was then populated by people known as the Taino. One region was controlled by the paramount chief, Wakanagari. On Christmas Eve, while coasting along the shore, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground.
When Wakanagari learned the news, he sent all his people from the town with many large canoes to unload everything from the ship. So great was the care and diligence which that king exercised, and he himself was as diligent unloading the ship as in guarding what was taken to land, in order that everything would be well cared for.
Grateful for the island leader's help, Columbus accepted his invitation to come ashore.
The admiral left to dine on shore and arrived at the time when 5 kings had come, all subject to the one who is called Wakanagari. Wakanagari came to receive the admiral as soon as he had reached land and took him by the arm.
Columbus was immediately struck by the beauty of Taino life.
The king observes a very wonderful estate in such a dignified manner that it is a pleasure to see. Neither better people nor land can there be. The houses and the villages are so pretty. They love their neighbors as themselves. And they have the sweetest speech in the world. And they're gentle. And they're always laughing. Christopher Columbus.
As a token of gratitude for the rescue of his men and supplies, Columbus presented Wakanagari with a red cape, a prestigious item among the Taino elite. In return, Wakanagari gave Columbus a golden tiara he wore on his head. To Wakanagari, it was a fair exchange, a gesture of mutual respect and recognition, the opening of trade between equals. To Columbus, it was a crown, a symbol of authority. Wakanagari was surrendering his lands and people to Spain. But Columbus was not simply looking to rule people. He saw something much more valuable to his future. He saw gold. the prize he could take back to his sponsors in Europe. There was wealth to be had, and to the Europeans of the time, wealth belonged to those strong enough to take it.
Now, I have ordered my men to build a tower and a fort. Not that I believe it to be necessary, for it is obvious that with these men that I bring, I could subdue all of this island, since the people are naked and without arms. But it is right that this tower be made, so that with love and fear, they will obey.
Leaving behind a contingent of men in a fort, built from the timbers of the Santa Maria, Columbus set sail for Europe. With him, he would carry the news of a new world, gold and docile island natives. Wakanagari and the Taino had no way of knowing what was about to happen to their ancient way of life. The Taino's ancestors were part of a series of migrations of South American Indian people dating back over 2,000 years. They farmed the land and harvested the wealth of the sea. Taino traders traveled in huge ocean-going canoes capable of carrying up to 150 men. Boats laden with feathers, gold, wood, pottery, beautiful birds, cotton fabric, and food. Island nations were woven together by trade. Trade was the communication system by which nations knew one another and maintained peace. Some trading partners even exchanged their names to create lasting bonds between their communities. By the time of contact, there were well over 1 million people living in the Caribbean. Local community leaders were subject to powerful regional leaders like Wakanagari, who controlled trade with large personal fleets and warehouses of commodities. Into this world, Columbus returned in November 1493 with a military flotilla of 17 ships. Under his command were armor-clad soldiers, mounted cavalry, attack dogs, and guns. The Spanish conquest of the Caribbean began. Gold mines were opened, and the Taino were enslaved, forced to mine the ore. A Spanish priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, who accompanied Columbus on his second voyage, spoke out against the cruel treatment of the Taino people.
It is not possible to recount the 100th part of what I have seen with my own eyes. A man had need to have a body of iron to undergo the labor they endure in getting gold out of the mines. They must delve and search 100 times over in the inner parts of the mountains till they dig them down from top to bottom. They must work the very rocks hollow. Bartolomé de las Casas.
Epidemics and famine swept the island. Yet the Spanish continued to demand that the beleaguered Taino supply them with both food and labor. Garrisons were strung across the island to fortify the gold fields. When resistance sprang up, Columbus sent out military units to terrorize towns into submission.
They were so relentlessly persecuted and pursued with their wives and children up into the hills, so tired, hungry, and harassed. And there went with them disease, death, and misery, just as if they had been killed in the wars. They died of hunger and sickness that surrounded them, and the fatigue and oppression that followed. After 1496, no more than a third remained of the multitudes that had been on the island.
Taíno's suffering was so severe that thousands took their own lives rather than submit.
Wherefore many went to the woods and there hung themselves, after having killed the children, saying it was far better to die than to live so miserably. Some threw themselves from the high cliffs down precipices. Others jumped into the sea, and others starved themselves to death. Benzoni, soldier for Spain.
Some escaped into the mountains, including Guacanagari, the paramount chief who had befriended Columbus. He soon died, a homeless wanderer. By 1503, 11 years after Columbus's first voyage, only a few pockets of resistance remained. In the mountainous region of Sharawa, Taíno people ruled by a woman named Anacaona successfully evaded Spanish demands for labor. Determined to break the resistance, the Spanish governor requested a diplomatic meeting. Anacaona agreed and summoned 80 regional sub-chiefs to her state house for the meeting. When the 80 leaders were gathered inside, the governor gave a signal and a thatched state house was set on fire. Soldiers lined up outside with swords. Taíno leaders who did not burn were killed as they fled the blaze. Anacaona was spared, only to be later executed by hanging. In the aftermath of the bloody carnage, a little boy stood among the ashes and smoke beside the charred remains of his father. A boy whose name the Spanish would come to remember well. Enrique. Although raised by Spaniards, he never forgot his own identity, heir to the chiefdom of the Bahoruco region of the island.
Enrique was a tall and graceful man with a well-proportioned body. His face was neither handsome nor ugly, but that of a serious and stern man. He married a native, a woman of excellent and noble lineage, named Doña Lucia. Bartolomé de las Casas.
The Spanish government created a labor grant system under which individual Spanish landholders were given village populations to use as forced labor. Enrique, his wife, and his people were turned over to a debauched young Spaniard named Valenzuela. They were at his mercy. The priest, Las Casas, protested.
In a more just world, Enrique would have been the master. Valenzuela viewed Enriquillo as a slave and valued him less than manure in the street.
Enrique complied with Valenzuela's tyrannical demands, for which he was rewarded with regular beatings and robbed of his last remaining possessions. His many appeals to Spanish authorities fell on deaf ears. When Valenzuela raped his wife, Enrique reached his breaking point. He and his followers escaped to their homelands in the lofty Bahoruco Mountains.
The Spanish came to call him the rebel Enrique, and those who followed him were termed rebels and insurgents. Although in truth they were not rebelling, but only fleeing from their cruel enemies who were misusing and destroying them, just as a cow or an ox tries to escape from the slaughterhouse. Bartolomé de las Casas.
Enrique organized his people. Women, children, and elderly were sent into caves high in the mountains, where they raised chickens and cultivated gardens to feed the resistance army. Scouts were posted on every crag and pass. Heavy boulders rolled into place above the footpaths. Enrique instructed his men to fight only in self-defense, to kill Spaniards only in the course of battle, and otherwise to simply deprive them of their arms. At first, the Spanish army was confident they would quickly crush the Taino resistance. But Enrique's people, armed only with spears, iron spikes, fish bones, and bows and arrows, fought with fierce determination against the Spanish and their sophisticated arms. Time after time, they forced the enemy to retreat. During one fierce battle, Valenzuela himself was captured. But even this mortal enemy's life would be spared. Enrique ordered him released. As word of Enrique's victories spread across the island, many Taino fled to his refuge and joined the fight for freedom. His legend grew. It was said that Enrique never slept at night, that he himself patrolled the village until dawn. For over a decade, he fought Spain to a standstill. Finally, unable to defeat the guerrillas on their own territory, an exhausted and humiliated Spanish government made overtures of peace.
I know the Spanish very well, because they killed my father and grandfather and all the people of the kingdom of Sharawa, and reduced the population of the entire island of Española. I have fled to my own land, where neither I nor any of my followers are harming anyone, but are simply defending ourselves against those who came to capture and kill us. I need not talk to another Spaniard. Enrique, Taino.
But there was one Spaniard to whom Enrique would still talk, the priest, Las Casas. After many years spent demanding the king act to stop Spanish atrocities in the New World, Las Casas had been officially designated protector of the Indians. He now sought out Enrique in his mountain stronghold. 2 months later, Las Casas and Enrique appeared before Spanish authorities and negotiated a truce. 14 years after it began, the rebellion came to an end, but only after the Spanish agreed to guarantee freedom for Enrique's people. At the base of the Cibao Mountains, Enrique settled with his 4,000 followers, the last members of a culture that had flourished for millennia. By the end of the century, the Taino population that Las Casas had estimated at 2 million was officially reported extinct.
What does the name DeSoto mean to me? It means the personification of evil.
In the late spring of 1539, less than 50 years after Columbus, less than 20 years after the fall of the Aztec Empire, Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto landed on the West Florida coast north of present-day Tampa Bay. He rode at the head of a 600-man army, 200 mounted. They were supported by 100 servants, herds of horses, pack animals, swine, and trained attack dogs. Unable to carry the quantity of food needed to support the massive expedition, De Soto would feed his men and animals on the bounty of the towns they entered. The invaders came prepared to take their provisions by force. In July, De Soto struck north into the lands of the Timucua people, chiefdoms of fishermen and farmers scattered across the northern Florida peninsula. One by one, villages were plundered by the marauding army. Indian people were enslaved as burden bearers, chained together with iron neck collars in groups of 30.
If they were men of virtue, they would not have left their own country. They have made highwaymen, adulterers, and murderers of themselves, without shame of men or fear of any god. Timucua.
But the Timucua were people who also knew of war. As the Spanish army advanced, news reached one leader, Urrutina, who was secure in a military strength that had never failed him. As the Spanish force neared Urrutina's town, De Soto sent a messenger ahead with a warning to submit or be destroyed. Urrutina responded.
I am king in my land. I and all of my people have vowed to die 100 deaths to maintain the freedom of our land. This is our answer, both for the present and forevermore.
De Soto entered Urrutina's town with his army in battle formation, but oddly, they met no resistance. The chief, who had promised such defiance, seemed to have completely submitted. But the surface belied the reality. While the Spaniards gorged upon the town's food stores, Urrutina secretly summoned fighting men from throughout the region. Then, playing out a military chess game, the young chief invited De Soto to witness Timucua military maneuvers in a large field. His plan? To amass his army and launch a surprise attack on the Spanish force. But De Soto had been forewarned by a spy. Matching the Indian leader move for move, he brought his army to the field in battle formation. To the rear of the Timucua force were 2 lakes. To their flanks were forest, and in front of them, the Spanish army. Suddenly, De Soto gave a signal. Urrutina was seized, and the Spaniards attacked. Spanish cavalry thundered forward, their horses' hooves driving into the Timucuan ranks. Outmatched, the Indian force fell back. Some ran towards the shelter of the trees. Hundreds more plunged into the lake nearby, swimming out into the deep water to evade their pursuers. The Spaniards fired into the lake, trying to force the Timucua to surrender. Indian resistors had to tread water constantly. But by nightfall, not a single man had yielded. A Spanish chronicler observed the agonizing struggle.
And now, they continued to torment the Indians, never once letting them set foot on the shore, hoping that they would become exhausted by the swimming, and as a result give up the more quickly. Thus, they threatened with death those who would not surrender. Regardless of how much the Castilians afflicted them, they could not do enough to keep them from showing their spirit and strength. For even though these men realized that they were without hope of help in the hardships and danger they were experiencing, some chose death as a lesser evil.
It was not until late the following morning that 200 survivors surrendered in a body.
They had been swimming 24 hours, and it was a great pity to see them emerge from the lagoon, half drowned and swollen and transfixed by the toil, hunger, fatigue, and lack of sleep they had suffered. Garcilaso de la Vega, Spanish chronicler.
The remaining 7 were dragged out of the water at knife point by De Soto's men. The Timucuan prisoners were chained and distributed among the Spanish soldiers as slaves. Urrutina was imprisoned inside his own statehouse. He would make one last act of defiance. Pretending to have passively accepted his defeat, he lulled De Soto within his reach. Suddenly, he lunged at the Spanish leader, smashing his face with chained fists.
The chief gave out such a tremendous roar that it could be heard for a quarter of a league around. The blow was so fierce that De Soto was unconscious for more than half an hour, and he bled through the eyes, nose, and mouth.
Simultaneously, Urrutina was gored by 12 swordsmen. Outside, the Timucua fell upon their captors, fighting with stones, pots of boiling food, anything at hand. The Spaniards turned upon them, killing indiscriminately.